Let's listen to a new story together.
The Last Lighthouse Keeper. My son stood in front of 70 people and called me incompetent. He said I was losing my mind. He said I talked to my dead wife's photograph like she could hear me. What he did not know was that she could. Because 3 days before that meeting, I found a letter Eleanor had hidden inside the wall of our lighthouse. She had been waiting for me to find it, and she had something to say. My name is Henry Calloway. I am 79 years old. I spent 30 years in the United States Navy, most of them at sea. Some of them in places I still do not talk about. I retired as a commander. I have seen men die and men be saved, and I have learned that the difference between the two is usually something very small. A decision made in a half-second. A rope that holds or does not hold. A door you open or do not open. Eleanor used to say I brought the sea home with me. She meant the silence. The way I could sit for an hour and watch the water without saying a word. And she would sit beside me and not say a word either. And somehow that was better than any conversation we ever had with anyone else. She has been gone 5 years now. Lung cancer. 14 months from the first diagnosis to the last morning. I did not hire a nurse. I did not put her in a facility. I gave her pills at 6 in the morning and 11 at night and 2:30 in the afternoon. And I changed her sheets when she needed them changed. And I sat with her every hour that she was awake. She wanted to see the ocean when she went, so I made sure she could. I positioned her bed facing the window, and on her last morning, the light on the water was something I will never be able to describe to anyone who was not there. After she was gone, I kept the rituals, the 2 cups of coffee, not because I forgot she was gone, because I did not want to forget that she had been here. I built this lighthouse with my hands. That is not a metaphor. Point Keeper Lighthouse in Cape May, New Jersey. Eleanor and I bought it in 1999 when it was nothing but crumbling brick and broken glass, and a tower that swayed in a strong wind. We spent 25 years putting it back together. I did the structure. She did everything else. The garden along the east wall. David Austin roses she ordered from England. Deep red. The kind that smell like something your grandmother would recognize. The reading room on the 2nd floor. Shelves she built herself because she did not trust anyone else to get the height right. The kitchen window positioned exactly to catch the morning light over the water. Every morning I climb 97 steps to the top of the tower to check the light. My knees remind me they are 79 years old. My back has opinions about the matter, but I climb. Eleanor asked me to keep the light on, so I do. My son Mitchell is 45 years old. He is a real estate developer in Philadelphia. He married a woman named Sharon, whose father is also in real estate. And sometime in the last 15 years, I stopped being his father and became, I think, a line item in a future financial plan. He calls me every Sunday for 3 minutes. We talk about the weather and whether the Eagles have a chance this season. Sharon never gets on the phone. I do not take it personally. I took it personally for about 3 years, and then I stopped because it was exhausting. And Eleanor told me once that you cannot love someone into loving you back. And she was usually right about things like that. Mitchell's mother and I divorced when he was 11. He lived with her, and then with me, and then with her again. The way children of divorce do, carried back and forth by the tide of adult decisions. I used my retirement savings to send him to Rutgers. I drove 3 hours every other weekend to watch him in whatever he was doing. I thought we were close. I thought that was what closeness looked like. Then Eleanor got sick, and Mitchell came for the funeral. And then he did not come back for 2 years. I told myself he was busy. I told myself grief makes people strange. I told myself a lot of things that were convenient, the way you do when the truth is something you are not ready to look at directly. Then, one Tuesday in October, Mitchell called. Not Sunday. Tuesday. I was up on the tower checking the light when my phone rang, and I looked at the name on the screen and felt something move in my chest that was not quite hope and not quite dread, but something that lived between those two things. I answered. He said, "How are you really doing?" Dad, 5 words. He had never said those 5 words to me in that order before. Not once in 45 years. I stood at the top of my lighthouse and looked out at the Atlantic Ocean, and I said I was fine. And I meant it. And I had no idea yet what those 5 words were going to cost me. They came on a Saturday morning 3 weeks after that phone call. I heard the car in the gravel drive before I saw it. A silver Mercedes SUV that I did not recognize until Mitchell stepped out of the driver's side. He looked the same as he always did. Well-dressed. Hair cut close. The kind of man who looked expensive without trying to look expensive, which meant he was trying very hard. Sharon came around from the passenger side. She was wearing a cream-colored coat and low heels that were not appropriate for a gravel driveway, and she walked carefully, picking her steps the way someone walks through a place they have already decided they do not respect. I had come down from the tower when I heard the car. I was standing on the front steps when they came through the garden gate, and for just a moment I let myself feel something simple and uncomplicated. My son had come home. Whatever his reasons, he had come. Mitchell hugged me. It lasted about 3 seconds, firm and brief, the kind of hug men give each other when they are not sure what else to do. Then Sharon hugged me too, and she said, "We have missed you so much, Henry." And her arms were around me for less time than his were, and her voice had the quality of someone reading from a script they had rehearsed, but not quite memorized. I said it was good to see them. I made coffee. We sat in the kitchen where the morning light came through Eleanor's window, and I watched my son look around the room the way a man looks around a room when he is calculating something, and I told myself I was imagining it. He asked about my health first. Blood pressure, cholesterol, whether I was sleeping. He asked about my medications, whether I was keeping up with my doctor appointments. He asked these things in the voice of a concerned son, and they were reasonable questions for a son to ask a 79-year-old father, and I answered them honestly because I had nothing to hide and no reason yet to believe I should. Then Sharon asked if she could use the bathroom, and I said of course. And she was gone for longer than a bathroom visit requires. When she came back, she sat down and picked up her coffee and smiled at me, and I noticed that her shoes had a small scuff on the right toe that had not been there before. The kind of scuff you get when you have been moving carefully through a house you do not know well, opening doors, looking at things. I did not say anything. I filed it away the way the Navy taught me to file things. Observe. Record. Do not react until you understand what you are looking at. After lunch, Mitchell helped me carry some boxes from the storage room to the hallway. It was something I had mentioned needing to do for weeks, and he offered without being asked, which was kind. And while we were doing it, he said, casually, the way you say something casual when it is not casual at all. Dad, have you thought about what happens to this place down the road? I mean, it's a lot of property for one person. I said I thought about Eleanor's garden and the light on the water in the mornings, and that was about as far as I got. He laughed. He said that was fair. He did not bring it up again that afternoon. But it was said, and we both knew it was said, and it hung in the air between us the way smoke hangs in a room after the fire is out. Sharon spent most of the afternoon offering to help tidy things. She organized the kitchen cabinets without being asked. She went through the filing cabinet in the study, holding up folders and asking whether they were important, whether they could be scanned, whether I had copies elsewhere. She did it with the cheerful efficiency of a woman who wanted to be useful, and I stood in the doorway and watched her and thought that Eleanor would have hated every second of this. Someone else's hands on her files, her papers, the accumulated documentation of a life. I did not say that either. By the time they left in the late afternoon, I was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hours I had been awake. I stood on the front steps and watched the silver Mercedes back down the drive. And when it reached the road and turned north toward the highway, I went inside and poured Eleanor's untouched coffee cup down the sink and washed it carefully and set it on the drying rack. I was walking through the living room on my way to the reading room when I saw it. The photograph on the mantel. Our wedding photograph. Black and white. Eleanor in a dress her mother had made. Both of us young enough that I sometimes had trouble recognizing myself in it. I had set it facing the room that morning, the way I always set it. Eleanor's face visible from anywhere in the room, the way she had always insisted on being visible, the way she would have laughed about if she knew I still arranged things to please her. The photograph was facing down, the glass pressed against the mantel, Eleanor's face looking at nothing but wood. I stood there for a long moment. The house was very quiet. I told myself it must have fallen. I told myself the vibration of the door closing had shifted it somehow. I told myself these things with the practiced patience of a man who has spent his whole life preferring reasonable explanations to the ones that keep him awake at night. I picked up the photograph and set it right. Eleanor looked out at the room again. I made myself believe it was the wind. The second time it happened. I could not blame the wind. Mitchell and Sharon came back the following Saturday. Same car, same careful steps through the garden, same coffee in Eleanor's kitchen. This time Sharon brought a casserole dish covered in foil, and she said she had made too much and thought I might like to have some, and I thanked her and put it in the refrigerator. And later that evening, I ate it standing at the counter because I did not feel like sitting at the table alone with food someone else had cooked in someone else's kitchen, for reasons I was beginning to understand, had nothing to do with generosity. They stayed 4 hours. When they left, I walked through the house the way I had started doing after their visits. Slowly, room by room, not looking for anything specific, just looking. The study, the reading room, the kitchen, the bedroom. The photograph on the mantel was facing down again. I stood in front of it for longer this time. I did not pick it up immediately. I just looked at it. The polished back of the frame, the small brass stand folded flat against the wood. Eleanor's face pressed down against the mantel like something being hidden. I thought about the Navy, about the things they taught you about patterns. One event is an accident. 2 events are a question worth asking. I set the photograph right. I went to bed. I did not sleep well. 4 days later, on a Wednesday morning, a man named Feldman knocked on my door. He was somewhere in his early 50s, pleasant-looking, carrying a leather bag that was the kind doctors carry in films about doctors. He introduced himself as a friend of Mitchell and Sharon's, and he said he had heard I was a veteran, and he was involved with a program that provided free health screenings to retired service members in the area, and he wondered if I had a few minutes. I let him in. I am not sure why. Looking back, perhaps because I was still trying to give everyone the benefit of the doubt. Perhaps because the offer was framed around something I respected. Service. And it is difficult to refuse something framed that way when you have spent your life inside it. He sat across from me at the kitchen table and asked me questions. Routine questions at first. blood pressure history, sleep patterns, diet. Then the questions changed. He asked whether I ever found myself forgetting where I was. I said not that I was aware of. He wrote something down. He asked whether I ever had conversations with people who were not present. I paused. I thought about Eleanor's photograph, about the mornings I said good morning to her image before I climbed the stairs. The evenings I told her about the weather and the water and whatever I had read that day. I said I talked to my wife's photograph sometimes. He wrote something down. He asked whether I ever forgot to eat. I said I sometimes forgot lunch. He wrote something down. He asked whether I had any trouble with dates and times. I told him I had an appointment with my actual doctor in 3 weeks, and I could give him the date and time from memory if he wanted. He smiled the way people smile when they do not find something funny and wrote something down. He was in my home for 40 minutes. When he left, he shook my hand and said he hoped I was taking good care of myself and that Mitchell was lucky to have such a sharp father. I watched his car pull away down Eleanor's walk, and I stood at the door for a moment and thought about what had just happened and did not like the shape of it. That night, I did what I had done almost every night for the past 5 years. I made a cup of tea and went to the bedroom and opened the drawer of the nightstand and took out Eleanor's notebook. The small one, dark green cover, worn at the corners from years of handling. She had carried it in her coat pocket for 25 years. Every room we repaired, every rose she planted, every poem she wrote sitting on the 97th step looking at the ocean. The whole history of what we had built together, in her handwriting. In a book small enough to fit in one hand. I read from it most nights. Not always the same entries. Sometimes I opened it randomly and read whatever she had written on that page. The way you might flip through an old record collection, looking for something that matched the mood of the evening. Her voice was still completely there in those pages. Clear and specific and hers. The way some people's voices stay in your ear long after they are gone. I read for about an hour. I set the notebook on the nightstand the way I always did, in the upper right corner, spine facing the wall. I turned off the light. In the morning, it was gone. I checked the drawer first, then the other drawer, then the floor beside the bed, under the bed, in the space between the nightstand and the wall. I went through the room methodically, the way the Navy taught me to search a space, quadrant by quadrant. Nothing skipped, nothing assumed. I went through the rest of the house the same way. The reading room, the study, the kitchen, the bathroom. Eleanor's notebook was not in my house. I sat down on the edge of the bed in the morning light, coming through the window, and I looked at the empty nightstand, and I felt something I had not felt since the morning Eleanor died. Not grief exactly. Something colder than grief. The particular chill of understanding that something irreplaceable is gone, and that it did not leave on its own. Someone had been in my bedroom. The notebook was gone. That meant someone had a key to my house and was not afraid to use it while I slept. I did not panic. Panic is a luxury for people who have not been trained to function without it. I sat on the edge of the bed for 10 minutes, thinking, turning the facts over the way you turn a mechanical problem over in your hands, looking for the point of failure. Someone had entered my home. Someone had taken Eleanor's notebook from the nightstand beside my bed. Someone had done this while I was in the house, possibly while I was sleeping 3 feet away. By mid-afternoon, I had worked myself around to the thing I needed to check. The basement stairs were narrow and steep. No railing on one side because when we built the house, we ran out of money for the railing and then got used to its absence. I went down carefully, one hand on the cold stone wall, my eyes adjusting to the dimmer light. The air down there smelled like damp concrete and sawdust, and something older, the particular smell of a space that holds more years than the rooms above it. Eleanor's potting bench was against the far wall, clay still embedded in the grain from roses she would never plant again. My woodworking tools hung on pegboard to the left, each one in its place. The chisels and planes and handsaws arranged the way the Navy taught me to arrange things. Every item accounted for. Every item where it belonged. In the corner, under the single hanging bulb, stood the gray steel cabinet. I reached into my pocket for the key I had carried on my ring for 25 years. The key whose weight and shape I knew the weight and shape of my own thumb. It did not fit. I pressed it in slowly, carefully, thinking perhaps the lock was stiff from the cold. The key slid partway in and stopped. It would not turn. The mechanism inside was different. The lock had been replaced. I knelt down and looked at the hardware. New brass. Bright against the scratched gray paint of the cabinet. Installed recently enough that I could see the faint marks where a screwdriver had slipped against the metal during installation. Someone had come into my basement with tools and time and replaced the lock on the cabinet where I kept every document that proved this lighthouse belonged to me. I pulled the handle. The door held fast. Through the narrow ventilation slots along the side, I could see paper inside. But I could not reach it, could not verify what was there and what was missing. Taped to the front of the cabinet, just below the new lock, was a folded piece of paper. I peeled it off and opened it. 4 lines. Handwritten in a script that was not mine. Originals transferred to Mitchell Calloway for safekeeping per verbal agreement. Copies remain on file. Contact Mitchell Calloway for access. For your protection. For your protection. I read those 3 words twice. The particular cruelty of them. Framing theft as care. Dressing robbery in the language of concern. I stood in my basement, holding that piece of paper, and I felt something I had not felt since the morning a fire broke out in the engine room of the Constellation. And the lights went dark, and the air filled with smoke, and I had to decide in 3 seconds which direction to move. Not fear. Something before fear. The awareness that the ground you are standing on is no longer solid, and that every decision you make from this point forward will determine whether you survive. Then the memory shifted. Not the engine room. Something older and softer. A Saturday in June. Mitchell was 8 years old, the first summer after his mother and I separated. I had taken him to the harbor at Cape May, the old commercial dock where the fishing boats came in. The wood was warm under our feet, and the sun was on the water, and I was teaching him to tie knots. The bowline, the cleat hitch, the figure 8. His small hands worked the rope with a patience that surprised me. The focus of a child who understood that some things required getting wrong before they could be gotten right. I had put my hand over his hands on the rope. I had said, "Every knot has to hold. Son, your life might depend on it someday." He had looked up at me, 8 years old, his eyes serious. Believing every word his father said, I stood in the basement of my lighthouse, 45 years away from that dock, holding a piece of paper that proved those hands had learned to tie a different kind of knot entirely. The kind that was designed not to hold, but to take. The kind that looked like security, but was made of theft. I folded the paper and put it in the pocket of my shirt and climbed the stairs back up to the kitchen. I washed my hands at the sink. I dried them on the cloth that hung from the hook Eleanor had installed 30 years ago. because she said every kitchen needed a hook in exactly the right place. I stood at the window and looked at the roses, the deep red David Austins along the east wall, bent slightly in the late afternoon wind. And I thought about roots and depth and what holds and what does not. The doorbell rang. I dried my hands and walked to the front door and opened it. A boy stood on the step. 17 years old, backpack over one shoulder, dark hair wet and flat against his forehead from the rain that had started while I was underground. He had Mitchell's jaw and Eleanor's eyes, that particular gray that looked almost green in certain light. He was breathing hard, the way someone breathes when they have been moving fast and are not yet sure they have arrived at the right place. He looked at me with an expression I recognized because I had worn it myself in the basement 5 minutes ago. The expression of someone who has just learned something they cannot unlearn. "Grandpa," Lucas said, "I need to show you something." I made him tea first. He was soaking wet, and his hands were cold, and whatever he had to show me could wait 3 minutes while I heated water. That was something Eleanor taught me. You take care of the person before you take care of the problem. I had not always been good at that, but I had gotten better. Lucas sat at the kitchen table and wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at me with those gray-green eyes and said he was sorry. I asked him what he was sorry for. He said he did not know where to start. I told him to start wherever it felt right. He opened his backpack and took out his laptop and set it on the table between us. He had taken photographs of his mother's screen, screenshots he had saved to his phone and then transferred. A dozen images lined up in a folder he had named with nothing but a date. The date from 3 weeks ago. The week before Mitchell and Sharon's first visit. I looked at the first image. It was an email. Sharon's address in the sender field. A name I did not recognize in the recipient field. A subject line that said simply, "Updated terms." The body of the email described a property in Cape May, New Jersey. A lighthouse and the surrounding land. Assessed value of $1.2 million. Agreed sale price of $3.5 million to a company called Coastal Apex Development. And at the bottom, in a section labeled Authorization, my name. Henry Calloway, in my handwriting, except that I had never written it. I looked at the signature for a long time. It was good, better than good. It had the slight leftward lean I had developed in my 40s when I started signing documents quickly. The particular way I crossed the Y in Calloway with a stroke that came back up instead of continuing down. Whoever had copied it had studied it carefully. I asked Lucas where they had gotten a sample of my signature. He scrolled to the next image. It showed another email, shorter, a single paragraph. Sharon writing to Mitchell. She mentioned the birthday card. She said she had taken it from the house after the funeral because the signature on the back was clean and clear and would work perfectly. She said she had kept it in her desk drawer for 3 years, waiting for the right moment. Eleanor had sent me a birthday card the summer before she got sick. She had signed the back because she always signed the back of my birthday cards, not the inside. The back because she said the inside was for everyone and the back was just for me. I had kept that card in the nightstand drawer beside her notebook, the drawer Mitchell had helped me clean out during their first visit, offering to organize things, being helpful, going through what needed to be kept and what could be thrown away. I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked Lucas to show me the rest. The next images were from a camera, still photographs, time-stamped, taken inside my house. The reading room, the kitchen, the bedroom. The quality was not perfect, but it was clear enough. I was in most of them. Sitting in Eleanor's chair in the reading room, standing at the kitchen counter with my back to the camera, lying in bed in the dark. I looked at the angle. I thought about the objects in my rooms, where each one sat, what lines of sight each one had. And then I understood. Eleanor's flower basket. The woven basket she had kept on the shelf in the reading room. The one I had never moved because moving it felt like erasing something. Someone had put a camera inside it. Someone had been watching me through Eleanor's flower basket for weeks. Lucas said he was sorry again. I told him to stop apologizing and show me the rest. The next email was between Sharon and Feldman. She addressed him by his first name. She asked whether the report was strong enough. She said the documentation needed to clearly support diminished capacity. She said the talking to photographs was good, but they needed more. Feldman replied that he would add the comments about the meals and the confusion about dates, and that it should be sufficient for the filing. I asked Lucas what filing. He scrolled to the last image. It was a legal document, partially visible, the header showing the words, "Petition for Guardianship of Financial Assets." And below that, my name. And below that, Mitchell Calloway listed as proposed guardian. I looked at that document for a long time. Lucas did not say anything. He was 17 years old, and he was sitting across from his grandfather in a kitchen that smelled like tea and old wood and the sea, and he had just handed the old man evidence that his parents were trying to have him declared incompetent so they could sell his home. Then I scrolled back to the email about the insurance. I had almost missed it. It was near the middle of the folder, a forwarded message between Sharon and an insurance broker, discussing a policy that had been taken out 3 years ago. A life insurance policy on Henry Calloway. Beneficiary listed as Mitchell Calloway. Value $2 million. 3 years ago. 3 months after Eleanor's funeral. When I had been so hollowed out by grief that I had signed whatever Mitchell put in front of me without reading it. Because I could not see the point of reading anything carefully when the person I had spent 50 years reading things carefully for was gone. He had sat beside me at Eleanor's funeral and held my arm during the burial and told me he would take care of me. And 3 months later, he had taken out a $2 million insurance policy on my life. I closed the laptop. I sat in the kitchen of the Lighthouse. Eleanor and I had built together for 25 years, and I listened to the rain on the windows and the sound of the Atlantic somewhere beyond the garden wall, and I thought about what I had spent my life doing. 30 years in the Navy. Every knot has to hold. Every bearing calculated. Every mission planned before the first move is made. I looked at Lucas. His hands were still wrapped around the mug. He looked frightened and young and braver than anyone his age should have to be. I said, "Thank you." Then I said, "Go home tonight and do not tell anyone you were here." He asked what I was going to do. I said what I had always done when someone needed to be outmaneuvered rather than overpowered. Plan a mission. I looked at Eleanor's photograph on the windowsill. The light behind her. The ocean behind the light. "It is time. Ellie," I said. "It is time." After Lucas left, I stood at the kitchen window for a long time watching the rain come down through the garden. The roses were bent low in the wind, the deep red ones Eleanor had ordered from England, and I thought about how she had planted each one by hand, on her knees in the dirt. 63 years old and still doing things herself because she did not trust anyone else to get the depth right. She had said the roots needed room to go down before they could go up. She said that about a lot of things. I picked up my phone at 11 o'clock that night and called a number I had not dialed in 4 months. Frank Russo answered on the second ring. He was 82 years old, and he did not sleep well, and he had told me once that the only calls worth taking after 10 at night were the ones that mattered. So he always answered. His voice was the same as it had been in 1969 on the USS Constellation, low and steady. The voice of a man who had decided long ago not to waste words on things that did not require them. I said, "Frank, it is Henry. I need you." There was a pause of about 2 seconds. Then he said, "I will be there by morning." I told him it was a 4-hour drive from Annapolis. He said he was aware of that. He said he would see me at 6. He arrived at 5:47. I heard his car in the gravel while I was still on the tower checking the light. By the time I came down, he was standing in the kitchen having found the coffee and made it himself, which was something Frank had always done in any kitchen he entered, operated as if he belonged there. Because 40 years in the Navy teaches you that wherever you are is where you are, and you had better make yourself at home. We did not talk inside. We took the whiskey up to the lantern room at the top of the tower, the way we used to take whatever we had to the highest point available when we needed to think clearly. The Atlantic stretched out below us, gray and enormous in the early light, and the wind was cold enough to remind you it was October, and we stood there with our glasses, and Frank let me talk without interrupting, which was his greatest skill, the ability to be completely present and completely silent at the same time. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you remember the constellation?" I said I remembered everything about the constellation. He said, "Engine room fire, November of '69. You went in when everyone else was going the other direction. You pulled me out." I said I remembered that too. He said, "I told you then I would pay that back someday." He looked at the ocean. He said, "Consider this the payment." We went over what I had, the emails Lucas had photographed, the fake contract with my forged signature, the camera in Eleanor's flower basket, the report Feldman had written to specification, the insurance policy, the document waiting to declare me incompetent. Frank listened to all of it and did not change his expression, which was the expression of a man who had seen worse and knew that seeing worse was not the point. He made 2 calls before 8 o'clock in the morning. The first was to Diane Park, an attorney in Cape May he had worked with on a veterans' benefits case 3 years earlier. The second was to a man in Washington, whose name he did not share with me. Someone he said owed him something. Someone who could verify the background on coastal apex development. I did not ask questions. Frank had always known people I did not know, and I had always trusted his judgment about which ones were useful. Diane Park arrived at her office at 9, and we were waiting outside when she unlocked the door. She was 55 years old, the daughter of a Korean shipwright who had come to Cape May in the 1980s and built small boats in a workshop on the north end of town. She had grown up around the water and around men who built things with their hands, and I felt immediately that she understood the particular weight of what I was trying to protect. She went through everything Lucas had documented. She read slowly and did not rush herself, and when she finished, she set the papers down and looked at me and said what she saw was a textbook case of elder financial abuse with a criminal forgery charge layered underneath it, and that the camera installation without consent was a separate civil and potentially criminal matter, and that the Feldman report, if she could prove it had been commissioned by a third party with predetermined conclusions, was a violation of medical ethics that could cost him his license. She said she would need a week to build the documentation properly. I told her I also wanted to file for historic landmark designation on the Lighthouse. She nodded as if she had expected this. She said the Cape May Historic Preservation Commission had a standing process, and with the right materials, it was achievable, and that once the designation was in place, the property could not be sold for commercial development, regardless of any legal challenges to ownership. I asked how long. She said she could have the initial application filed within 48 hours and a preliminary ruling in 3 weeks. I thanked her. Frank stayed to go over the details. I drove back to the Lighthouse alone. When I got home, I walked through the reading room slowly and stood in front of Eleanor's flower basket on the shelf, the woven handle. The silk flowers she had arranged in it the last summer. She was well enough to arrange things. The camera was in there somewhere, small enough that I had not seen it in 3 weeks of walking past it every day. I did not touch it. I stood in front of it for a moment and thought about what it meant. That Mitchell and Sharon were watching this room, watching me in this room, building their case from whatever I did inside my own home. And then I thought about what it also meant, that I now knew they were watching, and they did not know I knew. I sat down in Eleanor's chair, the one across from the bookshelf, the one that faced the camera directly. I looked at the basket for a long moment. Then I looked up at the ceiling the way a man looks at the ceiling when he is thinking about something far away. I said, out loud, to no one in particular, or perhaps to Eleanor, or perhaps to the camera. I said, I think I have one last mission left in me. Ellie. Then I got up and made dinner and went to bed. Over the next 5 days, I became someone I was not. It was the strangest thing I have ever done. Stranger than combat. Stranger than holding Eleanor's hand in the dark and listening to her breathing slow down over 14 months. I sat in my own home, in the rooms I had built with my own hands. And I performed confusion for an audience I could not see but knew was watching. It started on Tuesday morning. I stood in the kitchen and opened the cabinet where I keep the coffee mugs, and I let my hand hover in the air above them for about 10 seconds. My eyes unfocused, my mouth slightly open. I said, out loud, now what was I looking for? I held that pose the way an actor holds a moment on stage, long enough for the camera in Eleanor's basket to capture it, long enough for whoever reviewed the footage to write it down. Then I shook my head and reached for the mug and made my coffee as if nothing had happened. The performance cost me something I did not expect it to cost. Each time I pretended to forget, each time I let my face go slack and my eyes go distant, I felt a small piece of my dignity leave the room. I was 79 years old, and I was pretending to lose my mind in my dead wife's reading room for a camera hidden in her flower basket. There is a particular kind of humiliation in that, even when you are the one choosing it, even when you know it is strategy and not surrender. But strategy it was, and I had learned a long time ago that winning sometimes requires doing things that make you uncomfortable. On Wednesday, I called Mitchell. During our conversation, I asked him whether he had spoken to his mother recently. His mother had been dead for 11 years. There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that sounds like a man reaching for his phone to press record. And then Mitchell said very carefully, Dad, Mom passed away in 2015. I said, oh yes, of course. Forgive me. I must have been thinking of something else. I heard him exhale. I heard the relief in it. I also heard the calculation. On Thursday, I sat in the reading room and held a book upside down for 3 minutes, staring at the pages as if I were reading them. The camera was 4 feet away. I let my lips move slightly, the way people's lips move when they are reading something absorbing. Except there was nothing to read, because the words were facing the wrong direction. On Friday morning, I set 2 places at the kitchen table and put food on both plates and ate from one and occasionally looked at the other as if someone were sitting across from me. When I finished, I scraped the untouched plate into the trash. That one was not entirely a performance. I had been setting 2 places at that table for 5 years. The difference was that now I was doing it with the camera in mind, and the knowledge that someone was going to use this image of a lonely old man eating dinner with a ghost to prove that he could no longer be trusted with his own life. The performance worked. Mitchell called me outside of our usual schedule on Thursday evening. His voice had the soft, patient quality people use when they believe they are speaking to someone who is fading. He said he was worried about me being alone. He said he and Sharon had found some wonderful options, comfortable places near the water, assisted living facilities. He described 3 of them. He talked for 9 minutes, which was the longest conversation we had had in 5 years. And I said, and yes, and that sounds nice. And I heard his confidence growing with every syllable. After we hung up, I sat in Eleanor's chair and thought about what it felt like to be underestimated by your own child. It was not anger. Anger would have been simpler. It was something more like grief wearing a different coat. That night I did the last thing I needed to do. I sat down in the reading room after dark. I did not turn on the lamp. The only light came from the hallway behind me and from the faint glow of the tower above. I looked at the shelf where Eleanor's basket sat, where the camera was hidden, and I spoke. Not to the camera, not exactly, to the room, to Eleanor. To whoever was listening on the other end of whatever device was recording this old man in the dark, I said, "You know, Ellie, I think our boy has forgotten what it means to be a Calloway, but I have not. And I have got one last mission left in me." I sat there for a moment longer. Then I turned off the hallway light and went upstairs. I learned what happened next, much later, after everything was over, when Lucas told me the full story of those weeks from his side. Mitchell had been reviewing the camera footage that night from his laptop in Philadelphia. He had seen me sit down in the dark. He had seen me look toward the shelf. He had heard the words. And he had gone cold in his chair and called Sharon into the room and played it back and asked whether his father knew about the camera. Sharon had watched the footage twice. She had pointed at the screen and said, "He is talking to a photograph. Mitchell. He thinks he is talking to Eleanor. He does not know anything." Then she had gone back to her laptop. The email she sent that night went to Coastal Apex Development. It said, "Town Hall presentation confirmed for November 15th. Proceed." She was wrong about what I knew. She was wrong about everything. November 15th was 9 days away. I had 9 days to finish what Frank and Diane and I had started. I lay in bed that night and listened to the ocean through the window and thought about the pieces on the board and where each one needed to be when the moment came. 9 days. That was enough. 6 days before the town hall presentation, at 9:43 on a Tuesday night, my phone rang. I was sitting in the reading room with a book I was not reading, thinking about Diane's timeline and whether the Preservation Commission would have a preliminary response before the 15th. The phone showed Lucas's number. He had called me once since his visit. A short conversation to tell me he had gotten home safely and that his parents had not noticed anything. This was the second call, and it was late. And when I answered, I could hear his breathing before I heard his voice. He said, "Grandpa, they know." I set the book on the arm of the chair and sat forward. I asked him to tell me what happened. He said his mother had been looking for something on her laptop that evening, a file for work, and she had noticed that her email application showed a recent login from a device she did not recognize. She had checked the browser history. She had found the screenshots. She had found the folder Lucas had created, the one with nothing but a date for a name, and she had opened it and seen everything he had copied. And she had closed the laptop and carried it downstairs and set it on the kitchen table in front of him. She had said, "Explain this." Lucas said he had tried to lie. He had tried to say he did not know what she was talking about. But Sharon was not the kind of person you could lie to successfully. And she had looked at him with an expression he described as something between fury and calculation. And she had said, "You sent these to him. Did you not?" She had not asked it as a question. He said his father had come in from the other room. Mitchell had looked at the laptop screen, and then at Lucas, and then at Sharon, and his face had gone through several things in quick succession. Surprise. Then something that might have been fear. Then the particular hardness that settles over a man's face when he has decided to be angry instead of ashamed. Mitchell had said, "Do you have any idea what you have done?" Lucas told me he had said something then that he had been holding inside for a long time. He said he looked at his father and said, "You are the one who did something. You are trying to steal from Grandpa. You are trying to take his home. You promised Grandma you would take care of him. I was there. I heard you say it." There was a silence on the phone. I could hear Lucas breathing. I did not rush him. He said Mitchell had stood very still for a moment. Then his father had said, "You are 17 years old, and you do not understand how business works. And this is a family matter that does not concern you." Lucas said, "He is my family." He told me Sharon had stepped forward then and taken his phone out of his hand. She had taken his laptop. She had told him to go to his room and stay there until they decided what to do. She had said that what he had done was a betrayal of his own family and that there would be consequences. Lucas had gone to his room. They had locked the door from the outside, which I learned later was not a lock at all, but a chair wedged under the handle, the kind of solution that works on doors that open inward. He had sat on his bed for 20 minutes, listening to his parents argue downstairs, their voices coming up through the floor in fragments. Sharon's voice sharp and controlled, Mitchell's voice rising and falling the way it did when he was being told what to think and was in the process of agreeing. Then Lucas had done something that I will carry with me for the rest of whatever years I have left. He opened his window. His bedroom was on the second floor of a house in a suburb of Philadelphia, and the roof of the garage extended to about 4 feet below his windowsill. He climbed out onto the garage roof in his socks and slid down to the edge and dropped to the grass below and ran to the neighbor's house 3 doors down, a family named Ostrowski, whose daughter he had known since elementary school, and he knocked on their door at 10 o'clock at night and asked to use their phone. He was calling me from the Ostrowski's kitchen. His voice was steady now, steadier than it had been at the beginning. The way a person's voice gets steady when they have passed through the worst of their fear and come out the other side of it. He said, "I am sorry, Grandpa. I should have been more careful." I said, "Lucas, listen to me. You have nothing to be sorry for. You did what a Callaway does. You stood up for someone who needed you to stand up, and you did it when it cost you something. And that is the only kind of standing up that counts." He was quiet for a moment. I said, "Now I need you to do one more thing. On November 15th, there is going to be a meeting at the town hall in Cape May. I need you to be there. I do not care how you get there. Take a bus, take a train, walk if you have to, but be there." He said, "What about Mom and Dad?" I said, "Let me handle your mother and father. That is my job. Your job is to be in that room." He said, "Okay, "Grandpa," I said, "go home now. Sleep if you can." And Lucas, "Thank you." After he hung up, I sat in the reading room for a long time. The house was very quiet. The camera in Eleanor's basket was watching me, and I let it watch. I let whoever was on the other end see an old man sitting alone in a chair, not moving, not speaking, looking at nothing. Let them think whatever they wanted to think. I looked at Eleanor's photograph on the shelf beside the basket. "It is time." "Ellie," I said. For real this time. On the morning of November 15th, I climbed the 97 steps one more time. The light was still burning from the night before. I stood at the top and looked out at the Atlantic, flat and gray and very still, the kind of stillness that comes before weather changes. I thought about Eleanor standing in this exact spot the afternoon we first saw the lighthouse. She had looked at the water and then at me and said, "This is it. Henry. This is where we are going to live." I had looked at the crumbling walls and the broken glass and said, "Ellie, I think you might be out of your mind." She had laughed and said, "Probably. But build it anyway." I went downstairs and made 2 cups of coffee. One for me, one for her. I put on the navy blazer she had bought me for our 40th anniversary. I looked at myself in the mirror. An old man in a good jacket. Hands steady, eyes clear. I did not look like a man who needed anyone to manage his affairs. I picked up the folder Diane had prepared. Everything was inside. The preliminary approval from the Historic Preservation Commission, which had come through 4 days earlier. The forged signature analysis from a handwriting specialist in Trenton. The screenshots Lucas had taken. The emails. The insurance policy. The Feldman documentation. All of it organized with numbered tabs, precise and thorough. I drove to Town Hall. The Cape May Town Hall is a white wooden building on Washington Street, with a meeting room on the 2nd floor that seats about 70 people. By 3:30, the room was half full. Business owners, planning committee members, a few journalists from the County Herald, residents who had seen the notice about the development proposal. I took a seat in the last row, near the door. I set the folder on my lap and folded my hands over it and waited. Frank arrived 5 minutes later. Dress uniform, navy blue jacket, gold buttons. Ribbons arranged in the order prescribed by regulations he could still recite from memory. He sat beside me without a word, and crossed his arms and looked straight ahead with the expression of a man prepared to sit there for as long as it took. Diane came through a side entrance and took a seat near the front, briefcase at her feet. She did not look back at me. We had agreed that everything had to look unrehearsed. At 3:45, a silver Mercedes pulled into the lot. Mitchell got out in a charcoal suit and blue tie. Sharon came around from the passenger side, carrying nothing, walking beside him without touching him. They entered the building, and I heard their footsteps on the stairs. Mitchell went to the front table where a laptop and projector had been set up. He shook hands with a tall, gray-haired man in an expensive suit, the Coastal Apex representative. They spoke briefly, smiling. The way men smile when they are about to make each other a great deal of money. Sharon sat in the front row. She crossed her legs and looked around the room with the composed expression of someone who had already decided how this was going to end. She did not look at the back of the room. She did not see me. At 4 o'clock, the chairman called the meeting to order. He introduced the proposal as a commercial development on a parcel of land on the south end of Cape May, currently occupied by a private residence and a decommissioned lighthouse. Mitchell stood up. He clicked to the first slide. The screen showed a rendering, bright and clean. A glass and stone building rising from the exact spot where Eleanor's garden grew, where the roses she had ordered from England bloomed every spring, where she had knelt in the dirt getting the depth right. Cape May Lighthouse Resort and Spa, 200 rooms, full-service restaurant, private marina, $45 million investment, 300 permanent jobs. He spoke for 12 minutes. He was good at this, confident and measured. He talked about economic impact and community development. He used phrases like sustainable tourism and heritage-adjacent design. Several committee members were nodding. I looked past Mitchell to the doorway behind the projector screen. Lucas was standing there, jeans and a backpack and those gray-green eyes looking at me across the room. I nodded once. He stepped inside and sat down in a chair against the wall, half hidden behind the projector stand. Mitchell finished. The chairman thanked him and asked if there were any questions from the public. I stood up. The chair scraped against the wooden floor. Several people turned. Mitchell was still facing the screen, and when he turned around and saw me standing in the last row, his face went through recognition, then confusion, then something very close to fear. All of it in about 2 seconds. He said, "Dad, what are you doing here?" I picked up my folder. I stepped into the aisle. I walked toward the front. 79 years old, back straight, the way the Navy taught me to walk into any room, as if I had every right to be there and no intention of leaving. I said, "I am here to tell the truth about this contract and about my son." Mitchell moved faster than I expected. Before I had taken 3 steps down the aisle, he was already stepping away from the projector table and raising one hand toward the committee chairman, the gesture of a man who was accustomed to controlling rooms and did not intend to lose control of this one. He said, "If I may, Mr. Chairman." He said it calmly, respectfully, the voice of a professional addressing an audience he needed to keep on his side. The chairman nodded. Mitchell turned to face the room. He did not look at me. He looked at the committee members seated behind their long table at the front, and then at the audience, and then at a point somewhere above everyone's heads. The way people look when they are about to say something they want to appear difficult for them to say. He said, "Members of the committee, residents of Cape May, I want to apologize for this interruption. The man standing in the aisle is my father. His name is Henry Calloway. He is 79 years old, and he is not well." He paused. He let that land. He said, "My father is a decorated Navy veteran, and I am proud of his service. But over the past year, his health has declined significantly. He has difficulty remembering dates, names, appointments. He has conversations with people who are not present. He forgets to eat. He forgets to lock his doors. He lives alone in a large property that he can no longer maintain safely." I stood in the middle of the aisle, the folder in my hand, and I listened to my son describe me to a room full of strangers as a man who was disappearing. Mitchell reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a document. He held it up so the committee could see it. He said, "This is a medical evaluation conducted by Dr. Feldman, a licensed psychiatrist, who visited my father at his home 3 weeks ago. The evaluation indicates early-stage cognitive decline consistent with the beginning phases of dementia. It recommends supervised care and the appointment of a financial guardian." He set the document on the committee table. The chairman picked it up and looked at the first page. Mitchell continued, His voice had changed now. It had become softer, slower. The voice of a man who was struggling with something painful. He said, "I know how this looks. I know some of you might think I am trying to take advantage of my father. But the truth is, I filed for guardianship because I am terrified of losing him. I have already lost my mother. I cannot lose him too. Not like this. Not watching him deteriorate alone in a house he can barely manage." Then Mitchell did something I had not anticipated. He cried. Not dramatically. Not the kind of crying that looks performed. A single tear that he wiped away quickly with the back of his hand, as if he were embarrassed by it. As if he had not meant for anyone to see it. His chin trembled for just a moment. He looked down at his shoes and then back up at the committee and said, "I just want my dad to be safe. That is all I have ever wanted." The room was quiet. I looked at the faces of the committee members. I saw sympathy. I saw the particular expression people get when they believe they are witnessing a son's genuine anguish over a parent's decline. One woman near the end of the table had put her hand over her mouth. Another was nodding slowly. I looked at the audience. Several people were looking at me now, and in their eyes I saw what Mitchell had put there. Pity. The gentle, well-meaning pity of people who believed they were looking at an old man who did not understand what was happening to him. Sharon was sitting in the front row with her hands folded in her lap and her legs crossed, and on her face was an expression of quiet concern. The expression of a loving daughter-in-law who was worried about her husband's father. And if I had not known what I knew, I might have believed it myself. I looked at Frank. He was sitting in the last row with his arms still crossed, and his face had not changed. He was looking at Mitchell the way he had looked at officers who had tried to falsify inspection reports on the Constellation. Patient. Measuring. Waiting. I looked at Lucas. He was pressed against the wall behind the projector stand, his backpack on the floor beside his feet, and his face was white, and his hands were gripping the sides of the chair, and he was looking at his father with an expression that I recognized because I had worn it myself in the basement 3 weeks ago. The expression of someone watching a person they loved become someone they did not recognize. The chairman set down the Feldman report and looked at me. He adjusted his glasses. He said, "Sir, the gentleman has raised some concerns about your capacity. Do you have anything you would like to say in response?" The room waited. 70 people. My son, his wife, his business partners. A committee that was already leaning toward sympathy for the weeping son and pity for the confused father. A medical report on the table that said I was losing my mind. A presentation on the screen behind me showing what would replace everything Eleanor and I had built. I looked at the chairman. I said, "I do. May I?" He gestured toward the front of the room. I walked the rest of the way down the aisle. I set my folder on the edge of the committee table. I turned to face the room. I stood the way the Navy had taught me to stand when addressing a group of people whose attention I needed to hold. And I waited. I let the silence fill the room the way water fills a glass. Slowly, completely, until there was no space left for anything but what I was about to say. I did not raise my voice. I have never found much use in raising my voice. The Navy taught me that the quietest person in the room is usually the one most worth listening to, and I have carried that with me the way I have carried most things the Navy gave me. Carefully, permanently, without making a show of it. I said, "My son told you I am not well. He told you I forget things. He told you I talk to people who are not present. Let me tell you what I do remember. I remember buying a lighthouse in 1999 that was falling apart. I remember my wife Eleanor looking at it and saying, "Build it anyway." I remember spending 25 years doing exactly that. I replaced the foundation myself. I rebuilt the staircase, 97 steps, one at a time. I rewired the electrical system. I restored the original lantern housing at the top of the tower, the brass fittings, the Fresnel lens that had not been lit since 1962. My wife planted a garden along the east wall. David Austin roses, deep red, ordered from England. She built the bookshelves in the reading room with her own hands because she did not trust anyone else to get the height right. She wrote poems sitting on the 97th step looking at the ocean. Every morning for 25 years, I have climbed those steps to check the light. Every morning, including this morning, I paused. I let them see me. Not the old man Mitchell had described. Not the confused father who forgot to eat and talked to photographs. A man who climbed 97 steps at 5 in the morning and could stand in front of a room and tell them about it without losing a single detail. Then I said, "My son also told you he signed a contract to sell this property. What he did not tell you is how he signed it." I looked at Mitchell. He was standing beside the projector table, very still. I said, 3 years ago, 3 months after my wife's funeral, my son took a birthday card from my nightstand. It was the last card Eleanor ever gave me. She had signed the back, the way she always did, because she said the inside of a card was for everyone, but the back was just for me. My son took that card and used my signature on the back to forge my name on a $3.5 million real estate contract. He sold my home with a dead woman's birthday card. The room changed. I could feel it change the way you feel a tide shift. Not all at once, but completely. The water moving in a different direction than it had been moving a moment before. I nodded to Diane. She stood up from her seat near the front and walked to the committee table and opened her briefcase. She spoke clearly and without hurry. She presented the handwriting analysis from the specialist in Trenton, which confirmed that the signature on the Coastal Apex contract had been traced from a secondary source rather than written freehand. She presented the screenshots of Sharon's emails describing the use of the birthday card. She presented the documentation of the camera installed inside my home without my knowledge or consent, hidden inside a flower basket that had belonged to my late wife. She presented the emails between Sharon and Dr. Feldman, showing that the psychiatric evaluation had been commissioned by a third party with specific instructions to support a predetermined conclusion. She read aloud Sharon's words. "Make the report stronger. The talking to photographs is good, but we need more." She presented the life insurance policy. $2 million, taken out on my life 3 months after Eleanor's death. Beneficiary Mitchell Calloway. Signed during a period when I was so consumed by grief that I would have signed anything my son put in front of me without reading it. With each document she placed on the table, I watched the committee members' faces change. The sympathy that had been there for Mitchell drained away the way color drains from a sky before a storm. In its place came something harder, something that looked like the particular anger people feel when they realize they have been lied to by someone who was crying while he did it. Mitchell had not moved. Sharon had not moved. The Coastal Apex representative was leaning back in his chair with the expression of a man who was rapidly calculating how far he needed to distance himself from what was happening. Diane placed the final document on the table. She said, "This is the preliminary approval from the Cape May Historic Preservation Commission. designating Point Keeper Lighthouse as a protected historic landmark. Under New Jersey statute, a property with this designation cannot be sold, demolished, or developed for commercial purposes. The designation is effective immediately. She stepped back from the table. The chairman picked up the preservation document and read it. He read it again. He set it down. I stood at the front of the room and I looked at my son, and I thought about the boy on the dock learning to tie knots, and I thought about the man standing in front of me who had forged my name from a dead woman's birthday card. And I understood that those two people were the same person, and that understanding that was the most painful thing I had ever had to understand. Then I reached into the inside pocket of my blazer and took out a small book, dark leather cover, worn at the corners. Not the notebook Sharon had stolen from my nightstand. A different one. One I had not known existed until 6 days ago. I held it up so the room could see it. I said, "There is one more thing." I held the notebook so the room could see it. Small enough to fit in one hand. Dark leather. Worn soft at the corners the way leather gets when it has been handled many times over many years. It looked like the kind of thing a woman might carry in her coat pocket on long walks. The kind of thing she might open on a bench overlooking the water and write in with a pencil she kept behind her ear. I said, "Last week I was looking for something my wife had written. A notebook she kept for 25 years. A record of everything we built together in our lighthouse. That notebook was taken from my nightstand while I slept. I believe it was taken by someone in this room. I did not look at Sharon. I did not need to. I said, while I was searching for it, I found something I did not know existed. I found this." I told them about the 91st step. Every lighthouse has steps that settle differently than others. Steps that shift over the years as the building breathes and contracts with the seasons. The 91st step in our tower had always creaked. Eleanor and I both knew it. We had talked about fixing it a dozen times and never did. Because Eleanor said she liked knowing exactly where she was on the staircase even in the dark. And that creak was her landmark. Her way of knowing she was almost at the top. Behind that step, where the tread meets the riser, there is a loose brick. It has been loose for as long as I can remember. I never repaired it because it never seemed important enough to repair. 6 days ago, I knelt down on the 91st step and pulled that brick out of the wall, and behind it, in the space between the inner and outer wall of the tower, there was this notebook. I opened it. The handwriting was Eleanor's. I would know her handwriting in a room full of 1,000 pages. The particular slant of her letters. The way she crossed her T's with a stroke that went slightly upward. The way she dotted her I's with small circles. A habit she had kept from girlhood and never outgrown. She had written it before she died. I do not know exactly when. The entries are not dated, but from what she wrote, I believe she began it sometime in the last year of her life, when she was sick enough to know she was not going to recover, but well enough to still climb the stairs, still sit on the 97th step, still look at the water and think clearly about the things that mattered. I looked at the room. Every face was still. The chairman had taken off his glasses. The woman at the end of the table who had covered her mouth during Mitchell's speech had not moved her hand. I said, "I would like to read you something my wife wrote." I opened the notebook to the last page. Her handwriting was smaller here than in the earlier entries. The letters pressed closer together. The way handwriting gets when the hand is tired or when the person writing knows they do not have unlimited pages left. I read, "My dearest Henry, if you are reading this, then something has gone wrong. I have been watching, these last months, from the window of our reading room, and I have seen things that worry me. I have watched our son, and I have seen the way his wife looks at our home, not with love, Henry, with calculation. I pray I am wrong. I pray that what I am seeing is just the fear of a dying woman who is afraid of what will happen to the man she loves after she is gone. I stopped. I took a breath. The room was so quiet I could hear the wind against the windows. I continued. But if I am not wrong, then you need to know this. You built this lighthouse with your hands. Every step, every beam, every pane of glass. You built it because I asked you to, and you did it because that is who you are. You are the man who builds things when someone he loves asks him to build them. No one can take what you built unless you let them. Do not let them. Henry, stand tall, my love, like you always have, like the light at the top of our tower. My voice broke on the last word. I am not ashamed of that. I had held everything together for 3 weeks. Through the discovery and the planning and the anger and the 5 days of performing confusion for a camera hidden in my dead wife's flower basket. I had held it together through all of it because that is what the Navy teaches you to do. And that is what 79 years of living teaches you to do. But Eleanor's voice, coming through her handwriting, from a hiding place she had chosen because she knew I would find it when I needed it most. That was the thing I could not hold together through. I closed the notebook. I pressed it against my chest with both hands. I stood there for a moment with my eyes closed, and I let the room see what it looked like when a man who had spent his entire life being strong allowed himself, for just a few seconds, to not be strong. Then I opened my eyes. Frank Russo stood up in the last row. Full dress uniform. 82 years old. Back straight as a mast. He said, I served with this man for 30 years. He pulled me out of a burning engine room in 1969. I owe him my life. Earl Henderson stood up beside him. 77. Retired electrician. He said, Henry rewired my house after the storm of '08 and would not take $1 for it. Hank Moretti stood up. 79. Former Marine. He said, Henry drove my wife to her chemotherapy appointments every Tuesday for 6 months when I broke my hip. Never missed one. Douglas Fife stood up. 81. Retired postal worker. He said, Henry Calloway is the reason I joined the Veterans Breakfast Club instead of drinking myself to death after my wife passed. He is the reason I am still here. One by one they stood. 12 people in all. Neighbors. Veterans. People who had lived beside Henry Calloway for years and knew what kind of man he was not, because he had told them, but because they had watched him. Day after day. Year after year. Climbing 97 steps every morning to keep a light burning that no one had asked him to keep burning except the woman he loved. The chairman called for a vote. The committee voted unanimously to reject the Coastal Apex Development proposal. They voted unanimously to affirm the historic landmark designation of Point Keeper Lighthouse. I looked at the front row. Sharon's chair was empty. I had not seen her leave. I looked at Mitchell. He was standing beside the projector table in his charcoal suit, alone. And his face had the particular emptiness of a man who has just watched everything he planned collapse in the space of 20 minutes. Lucas walked across the room from behind the projector stand. He walked past his father without stopping. He came to where I was standing, and he put his arms around me, and I put my arms around him, and we stood like that for a long time while the room began to empty around us. 3 days after the town hall meeting, I was in the garden cutting back the roses for winter when I heard a car in the drive. It was not the silver Mercedes. It was a black sedan I did not recognize. A rental. The kind of car people drive when they do not want to be identified by their own vehicle. The engine shut off, and Sharon got out alone. She was wearing a dark coat and flat shoes. Practical shoes. The kind she would never have worn to the town hall. No jewelry. No makeup that I could see. She looked like a woman who had come to do something she considered unpleasant but necessary. The way you might look when you are going to close a bank account or cancel a subscription. She walked through the garden gate without waiting to be invited. She came to where I was standing with the pruning shears in my hand and the roses around me, and she said, "Can we talk?" I set the shears down on the stone wall and wiped my hands on my trousers and said, "Come inside." She sat down at the kitchen table. She sat in Eleanor's chair, the chair that faced the window, the chair where Eleanor had drunk her morning coffee every day for 25 years. I do not know if Sharon knew it was Eleanor's chair. I do not think she would have cared. I did not offer her coffee. I sat down across from her and waited. She did not cry. She did not apologize. She did not do any of the things a person might do when they have been caught doing what she had been caught doing. She looked at me across the table with clear eyes and a steady voice, and she said what she had come to say. She said, "You think this is over. It is not." I said nothing. She said, "I still have the footage from the camera. 3 weeks of you talking to a photograph, forgetting to lock the door, eating meals for 2. I still have Feldman's report. I still have the documentation of your behavior that any family court judge would look at and wonder about. I can file for guardianship in state court. I can drag this through the system for years. Discovery, depositions, expert witnesses, appeals. I can make this the thing you spend the rest of your life dealing with." She paused. She looked at me the way she had looked at the lighthouse the first time she saw it. Measuring, calculating the value. She said, "You are 79 years old. Henry, you do not have years." I sat across from her in the kitchen, where Eleanor and I had eaten 10,000 meals together. And I looked at this woman who had married my son and turned him into something I did not recognize. And I felt something I did not expect to feel. Not anger. I had used up most of my anger. What I felt was something closer to clarity. The particular clearness that comes when you understand exactly what you are looking at and are no longer afraid of it. I said, "You are right. I do not have years. I might have 5. I might have 10. I might have 2. None of us knows," I said. "But I have something you do not have." Sharon. She waited. I said, "I have people who will remember me with love after I am gone. I have a grandson who climbed out of a window and ran through the dark because he believed I was worth protecting. I have friends who stood up in a room full of strangers and told them what kind of man I am. I have a wife who hid a letter in a wall because she knew that someday I would need to hear her voice again." I looked at her. I said, "Can you say the same? Is there anyone in your life who would climb out of a window for you?" Sharon looked at me for a long time. Her face did not change. Nothing moved behind her eyes. She was the same person she had been when she walked in, and she would be the same person when she walked out. And I understood then that this was not someone who was going to be changed by anything I said, because change requires something inside that is capable of being moved. And whatever was inside Sharon had been fixed in place a long time ago. She stood up. She picked up her purse. She walked to the door. She stopped in the doorway and turned back and said, "Eleanor did not tell me she wanted you to sell the Lighthouse. I made that up. I thought you should know." Then she left. I sat at the table for a while after the sound of her car faded. Then I stood up and went to Eleanor's chair, and I took a clean cloth from the kitchen drawer, and I wiped down the seat and the arms and the back of the chair, carefully, the way you clean something that has been touched by hands that had no right to touch it. 2 weeks later, I learned from Diane that Sharon had filed for divorce. She had kept the house in Philadelphia. She had kept the savings account. She had taken what was useful and left what was not, which included Mitchell. Mitchell was served with papers from the Cape May County Prosecutor's Office the same week. Forgery, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, fraud. Diane told me the charges could carry up to 10 years. Coastal Apex withdrew from the project entirely and filed a civil suit against Mitchell for the $500,000 deposit he had already received and spent. In the space of 2 weeks, my son lost his wife, his career, his reputation, and his freedom was now a matter for the courts to decide. I sat on the front step of the Lighthouse and looked at the ocean and thought about a boy on a dock learning to tie knots. And I thought about the knots that had not held. He came on a Sunday in December, a month after the town hall. I heard the car before I saw it. Not the silver Mercedes. Something smaller, quieter. The tentative sound of an engine that had been driven a long distance by someone who was not sure the trip was worth making. I was in the workshop, fitting a new hinge on a cabinet door. And when I looked through the basement window, I saw a sedan I did not recognize parked crookedly on the gravel. One tire on Eleanor's garden border. And I thought she would have had something to say about that. Mitchell got out. He stood beside the car for a long time without moving, the way people stand outside of hospitals and courthouses, gathering themselves before they go in. He was wearing a jacket I had never seen, dark green, the kind of lightweight thing you buy at a department store when the clothes you used to wear no longer match the life you are living. He was thinner than the last time I had seen him at the town hall. His hair was longer. His shoulders had a slope to them that had not been there before. The particular downward curve that comes when a man has been carrying something heavy and invisible for too long. It was raining. Not hard. The kind of cold December rain that gets into your collar and stays there. He did not have an umbrella. He walked through the garden gate and down the path between the dormant rose beds. The bare canes tied to the trellis. Nothing blooming. Just the structure of what Eleanor had planted. The bones of something waiting for spring. I went upstairs and opened the front door and stood on the step. He stopped about 10 feet away. We looked at each other across that distance, and the distance was not 10 feet. It was 5 years of silence and 3 weeks of betrayal and a birthday card stolen from a dead woman's nightstand and a camera hidden in her flower basket and a $2 million bet on my death. He said, "I am sorry, Dad." His voice cracked on the last word. Not a performance this time. I had watched my son perform in front of a room full of people 6 weeks ago, and I knew what his performing looked like. This was not that. This was the sound of a word breaking under the weight of what it was trying to carry. I said, "For what exactly?" He opened his mouth and closed it. Rain collected on his forehead and ran down beside his nose, and he did not wipe it away. I waited. Patience is not a gift. It is a skill. I had been building it for 79 years. He said, for all of it. I said, that is not good enough. Mitchell, I need you to say it. He looked at the ground. Then he looked up, and his eyes were the red of a man who had not slept properly in weeks. The particular exhaustion that comes not from lack of rest, but from the inability to stop reviewing in the dark. The inventory of what you have done and cannot undo. He said, for the signature, for taking Mom's birthday card, for the camera in her basket, for Feldman, for the insurance, for the contract, for telling everyone you were losing your mind. He stopped. He swallowed. The rain was coming down a little harder now. I could hear it on the garden stones and on the roof of the porch above me, and on the leaves of the holly bush beside the door, each surface receiving it differently, each surface making its own sound. He said, for not coming back after she died, for not calling, for not being here when you needed me, for breaking my promise to her. There it was. The thing beneath all the other things. Not the money, not the property, not the legal architecture of his betrayal. The promise he had made to Eleanor while holding her hand. The promise I had heard him make in the room that smelled of hospital soap and salt air, and something else that I later understood was the smell of a life completing itself. I said, come inside. The kitchen was warm. I had left the heat on that morning because the cold had gotten into the walls overnight, and the room had that particular feeling of a space that has been holding warmth for someone who has not yet arrived. I made coffee. The machine clicked and hissed, and the smell filled the room. The smell that Eleanor used to say was the real reason she married me, because I made the best coffee she had ever tasted. Which was a lie, but a useful one. I set a cup in front of him. He wrapped both hands around it the same way Lucas had done weeks earlier, the same gesture, grandfather to grandson to father, the same need for something warm to hold when everything else has gone cold. I sat down across from him. I looked at my son. I said what I had spent a month preparing to say. I said, I am not going to list what you did. You know what you did. The courts will decide the legal part. What I want to tell you is something else. I said, I raised you. I taught you every knot the Navy taught me. I used my retirement savings so you could go to college. Your mother wrote poems about you when you were little. She believed in you until she could not believe in anything anymore. And she hid a letter in a wall because she was afraid of what you would become. And she was right. Mitchell was staring at the table. His hands had not moved from the cup. I said, I am not closing the door forever. The door is not closed, but it is not open either. It is where you put it. And it is going to stay there until you move it. Not with words, not with apologies, not with one visit in the rain, with years. Mitchell, with the slow, unglamorous, daily work of being a decent man when there is nothing in it for you and nobody is watching. I said, can you do that? The kitchen was very quiet. I could hear the rain on the window glass and the clock on the wall above the stove. The clock Eleanor had bought at a flea market in Cape May the year we moved in. The one that ticked slightly louder than a normal clock, which she said gave a kitchen its heartbeat. He said, I do not know. I looked at him across the table, across the coffee, across 45 years. A man in a cheap jacket sitting in the kitchen his mother had designed, stripped of everything he had accumulated until there was nothing left but the question of whether the person underneath it was someone worth rebuilding. I said, "That is the first honest thing you have said to me in 10 years. Something moved across his face. Not hope. Something smaller and more fragile, like the first green shoot that comes up through soil after a long winter. The kind you can miss if you are not paying attention. The kind that might not survive, but is alive." He finished his coffee. He stood. He said he would call. I said I would answer. I walked him to the door. He stopped on the step and looked up at the tower. The light was already burning in the gray afternoon sky. He said, "You still keep the light on?" I said, "Every night." He drove away slowly. I stood on the step until the sound of his car was gone. Then I went back to the kitchen and washed both cups, his and mine. I set them on the drying rack beside Eleanor's cup, the one I never washed, because washing it felt like agreeing she was gone. And I stood at the window and watched the rain fall on the roses and the ocean beyond them until the light changed and the day let go of itself and the evening came in. The first time I opened the door of the lighthouse to strangers was on a Saturday morning in March, 5 months after the town hall meeting. There were 11 of them. A group of 4th graders from Cape May Elementary on a field trip. Their teacher, a young woman named Avery, who had read about the landmark designation in the County Herald and called to ask if they could visit. I said yes before I had time to think about what that meant. I had spent 5 years in this building talking to a photograph. Now I was going to talk to 11 children who would ask questions I had not anticipated and touch things I had spent 25 years preserving and track sand across floors Eleanor had kept spotless. They came through the garden gate in a line, loud and disorganized the way children are, and I stood on the front step and watched them and felt something shift inside me. A door opening to a room I had forgotten was there. I said, "Welcome to Point Keeper. Let me tell you about the woman who built this garden." I told them about Eleanor. Not about the cancer or the 14 months or the morning she died looking at the ocean. I told them about the roses, how she had ordered them from England because she said American roses were too polite and she wanted roses with character. How she had knelt in the dirt at 63 getting the depth right because she believed roots needed room to go down before anything could go up. A boy in the back raised his hand and asked if the light at the top still worked. I said it did. He asked why. I said because someone I loved asked me to keep it on. He seemed satisfied with that answer. After the children left, I stood in the garden and looked at what they had done to my morning, which was to fill it with noise and questions and the kind of energy that I had not realized I was missing until it was there and then gone. I called Frank that evening and told him about it. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Sounds like you just found your next mission, Commander." He was right. Over the following weeks, I began to build something I had not planned to build. I cleared the storage room on the ground floor and turned it into a small exhibition space. I mounted photographs on the walls, images from Eleanor's collection, the lighthouse before and after. The two of us standing in front of it in 1999, surrounded by rubble and grinning like people who had lost their minds. I framed some of Eleanor's poems and hung them beside the photographs. I set up a table with maps of the Cape May coastline and a model of the lighthouse I built from balsa wood over the course of 2 weeks, working in the evenings with the kind of concentration I had not felt since the Navy. Frank came down from Annapolis and helped me install shelves for the naval history section. We put up photographs from the Constellation and from other ships, and from the years when Cape May had been a training ground for the Navy and the Coast Guard. Frank brought his medals and laid them out in a glass case, and when I asked if he was sure he wanted to leave them, he said they were not doing anyone any good in a drawer in Annapolis. Earl and Hank and Douglas came by on a Saturday and did not leave. They became the unofficial guides of Point Keeper, showing up on weekends when visitors came, telling stories about the town and the water and the years they had spent living beside both. Earl had a talent for making children laugh. Douglas had a way of explaining how a lighthouse works that made adults lean in and listen. Hank mostly stood by the door and nodded at people, which was his way of being welcoming. And it worked. I started the mentoring program in April. I called it Keeper's Watch. It was simple. Teenagers from Cape May could come to the lighthouse on Saturday mornings and learn practical skills. Woodworking, basic electrical repair, knot tying, how to read a tide chart, how to use a compass, how to fix something that was broken instead of throwing it away and buying a new one. The first Saturday, 3 teenagers showed up. By the 4th Saturday, there were 9. They came for different reasons. Some came because their parents made them. Some came because they had nowhere else to be. One boy came because he wanted to learn how to build a bookshelf for his mother. And I showed him how. And when he finished it and took it home, I felt something I had not felt in a long time. The particular satisfaction of watching someone build something with their hands and knowing it would last. In May, I went to a nursery in Wildwood and bought 3 David Austin rose bushes. Deep red, the same variety Eleanor had planted. I brought them home and knelt in the dirt in the garden beside the east wall, in the spaces where 3 of Eleanor's original bushes had been cut down to stumps months earlier during one of Sharon's visits, cut back for photographs that were meant to show the property at its most marketable. I had not replanted them until now because I had not been ready, and now I was. I put them in the ground the way Eleanor had shown me, deep, with room for the roots to go down. I watered them and stood back and looked at them. 3 small green things in the dirt that did not look like much yet but would, given time, become what they were meant to become. In June, the Cape May City Council voted to rename the gravel path leading from the main road to the lighthouse. They called it Eleanor's Walk. Frank called me that evening. He said, "She would have hated the attention." I said, "She would have pretended to hate it, and then walked down it every morning with her coffee, smiling." We laughed. It was the first time in a long time that laughing did not feel like something I was doing instead of something else. Summer came. The lighthouse filled with visitors and volunteers and the sound of hammers from the workshop where the Keeper's Watch kids were building things. I climbed the 97 steps every morning and checked the light and looked at the ocean and drank my coffee at the top of the tower. And Eleanor's cup sat on the windowsill in the kitchen below, waiting, the way it always waited, the way it always would. One evening in late July, I was sitting on the tower watching the sunset when I noticed the clouds on the western horizon, dark and heavy, stacked high. The kind of clouds that sailors learn to read before they learn to read anything else. The air had changed. There was a thickness to it, a pressure that I could feel behind my eyes. Far out over the water, I heard thunder. The email arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in the first week of August. I was in the workshop replacing a hinge on the display case Frank had donated when my phone buzzed on the workbench. The sender was Lucas. The subject line said, "Read this before anyone else." I wiped the sawdust from my hands and opened it. He had attached a document, a single file, The title at the top of the first page said, "The Keeper." Below that it said, "Columbia University Admissions Essay. Lucas Calloway." I read it standing at the workbench with the sawdust still on my shirt, and the smell of oak in the air, and the late afternoon light coming through the workshop window at the angle Eleanor used to say, made everything look like a painting. He did not write about the town hall. He did not write about the forged signature or the camera or the insurance policy or any of the things that had happened in the fall. He did not write about his parents. He wrote about the stairs. He wrote about visiting his grandfather on weekends and watching him climb 97 steps every morning to check a light that no ship needed and no regulation required. And how he had asked once why he did it, and his grandfather had said, "Because someone I loved asked me to." And how that answer had seemed too simple at the time, but had grown larger in his understanding the way certain answers do, the way they start as small things and become, over years, the largest things you know. He wrote about the coffee, 2 cups every morning, one for a man who was still here, and one for a woman who was not. He wrote that most people would call that a habit or a ritual or maybe even a symptom of something clinical, but that he had come to understand it as something else entirely. He called it faithfulness. He said faithfulness was not a word people his age used very often, but it was the only word that fit. He wrote about hands, his grandfather's hands, thick and rough, the knuckles enlarged from decades of work, the calluses layered over calluses, the particular topography of a life spent building and repairing and holding things together. He wrote that those hands had built a lighthouse and repaired a foundation and rewired a house and tied knots on Navy ships and held a dying woman's hand for 14 months without once letting go. He wrote that those same hands had made him tea on a rainy night when he showed up at the door with evidence that his own parents were trying to steal everything those hands had built. He wrote about integrity. He said his grandfather had taught him that integrity was not something you performed for an audience. It was not a speech or a declaration or a social media post. It was the thing you did at 5 in the morning when no one was watching, and there was nothing in it for you except the knowledge that you had done it. It was climbing 97 steps. It was keeping a light on. It was making a second cup of coffee. He ended the essay with a paragraph I had to read 3 times because my eyes would not stay clear enough to read it in one pass. He wrote, "The word keeper has 2 meanings. It means the person who watches over something, who maintains it, who keeps the light burning. But it also means something worth holding on to, something you do not let go of. My grandfather is both. He is the keeper of a lighthouse, and he is a keeper. I want to spend my life becoming someone worth keeping." He showed me how. I set the phone down on the workbench. I stood there for a moment, with my hands flat on the wood and my head down, and I let the tears come the way I had let them come in the town hall, without fighting them, without being ashamed of them. Because there are moments in a life when the only appropriate response to what you are feeling is to let it move through you without resistance. I picked up the phone and climbed the 97 steps to the top of the tower. I read the essay again, sitting on the step where Eleanor used to sit, the step where she had written her poems, and I read it with her beside me the way she was always beside me, not visible but present, not gone but changed into something that lived in the spaces between the words her grandson had written. I said, "You see that? Ellie, our grandson wrote about us." 3 weeks later, Lucas called. He had been accepted to Columbia University, early admission, Department of History. I was the first person he told. His voice on the phone had the particular brightness of someone who has just received news that confirms something they had hoped was true about themselves, but had not been certain of until that moment. I said, "Your grandmother would be very proud." He said, "I know. I think that is why I got in. I think she put in a good word." I laughed. It was a good laugh, the kind that comes up from somewhere deep and does not apologize for itself. That summer, Lucas came to Cape May. He took the bus from Philadelphia with a duffel bag and a stack of books about maritime history. And he stayed in the guest room, and he climbed the 97 steps with me every morning, and we checked the light together and drank coffee at the top of the tower, looking at the ocean. We built a wooden observation platform together. Nothing elaborate. A simple deck extending from the east side of the lighthouse, overlooking Eleanor's garden and the water beyond. Cedar planks, stainless steel bolts. A railing Lucas designed himself after I showed him how to calculate the load. It took us 2 weeks. We worked in the mornings when the air was cool and stopped in the afternoons when the heat came off the water. On the last evening before he went back to Philadelphia to prepare for his first semester, we sat on the platform we had built and watched the sunset over the Atlantic. The sky was red and gold, and the roses in Eleanor's garden were in full bloom. The deep red ones, the ones with character, and the air smelled like salt and cedar shavings and something else that I could not name, but that I think was simply the smell of a life being lived the way it was supposed to be lived. Lucas said, "I will be back for Thanksgiving." "Grandpa," I said, "I will leave the light on." He smiled. He had Eleanor's smile. I had never noticed that before. That night, after Lucas had gone to bed, I stood on the platform alone. The sky had changed. The red and gold were gone, replaced by something darker, heavier. The clouds had been building for days along the western horizon, and now they were closer, thick and layered, and the wind had shifted direction. The air had that weight to it again, that pressure behind the eyes. Lightning flickered somewhere far out over the water, too distant for sound. A storm was coming. The storm hit at 2 a.m. I was not asleep. I had been lying in bed listening to the wind build for hours. The way it started as a low whistle in the eaves, and then grew into something deeper, something with weight behind it. The kind of wind that does not go around things, but goes through them. The windows rattled in their frames. The old timber of the lighthouse groaned the way timber groans when it is being asked to hold more than it was built to hold. The rain came next. Not the kind of rain that falls, the kind that is thrown. It hit the windows sideways, hard enough that it sounded like gravel, and through the glass I could see nothing at all. Just black water moving in every direction at once. I lay there and listened to it, the way I had listened to storms at sea, with the particular attention of a man who knows that weather is not personal, but is also not something you ignore. I thought about the foundation I had repaired in 2003, the bolts I had replaced in the tower casing, the drainage system I had installed along the east wall to keep water away from Eleanor's roses. I thought about whether each of those things would hold. Then the lightning came, not the distant flicker I had seen from the platform. This was close. A crack that split the air directly above the tower, so loud it was less a sound than a physical force, something that went through the walls and into the bed frame and into my chest. The room went white for a fraction of a second, and then black again. And in that black, I noticed something missing for 25 years. When I lay in bed at night, there had been a faint glow coming from the stairwell, the light at the top of the tower, reflecting down through the spiral of the staircase. a soft amber warmth that reached all the way to the ground floor like a pulse. Eleanor used to say it was the lighthouse breathing. The glow was gone. I got out of bed. I walked to the bottom of the staircase and looked up. The stairwell was completely dark. No amber. No pulse. Nothing. The light was out. I stood there for a moment in my pajamas and bare feet on the cold stone floor. 79 years old, alone in a storm, looking up at 97 steps of darkness. I thought about what a reasonable man would do. A reasonable man would wait until morning. A reasonable man would call an electrician. A reasonable man would acknowledge that climbing a lighthouse tower in a storm in the middle of the night at 79 was not something a reasonable man does. I put on my boots. I took the flashlight from the hook by the door. I started climbing. The first 30 steps were just steps. My knees complained the way they always complained. The familiar argument between what my body wanted to do and what I was going to make it do regardless. The flashlight beam moved across the curved wall, catching the photographs I had hung along the staircase. Eleanor and me in our younger years, the lighthouse in various stages of repair, the ocean in different seasons. At step 40, the wind was louder. The tower swayed. Not much. A few millimeters, perhaps, but I could feel it in my feet. The slight displacement. The building adjusting to forces it had not felt in years. I put my hand on the wall and kept climbing. At step 60, the rain was coming through a crack in the mortar I had not known was there. Water ran down the inside of the wall in a thin sheet and pooled on the steps and made the stone slippery. I slowed down. I tested each step before I put my weight on it. The flashlight was getting dimmer. At step 77, my left knee locked. It seized the way it sometimes did when the weather changed. The cartilage protesting a conversation it no longer wanted to participate in. I stopped. I leaned against the wall and breathed through it and waited for the joint to release. And while I waited, I thought about Frank saying, "This is a mission. Henry." And I thought about Lucas writing, "Integrity is the thing you do at 5 in the morning when no one is watching." And I thought about Eleanor saying, "Build it anyway." The knee released. I kept climbing. At step 91, the stair creaked under my foot. The loose brick was there in the wall beside me. The hiding place where Eleanor had left her letter. The place where she had known I would eventually look. I touched the brick with my fingertips as I passed. It was cold and wet and solid. I reached the top. The lantern room was chaos. Rain poured through a crack in the glazing where the lightning had struck. The Fresnel lens was intact, but dark. The electrical connection severed at the junction box on the north side of the housing. I could see the damage in the flashlight beam, a blackened wire, a blown fuse, the simple and fixable consequence of a direct lightning strike on a system I had maintained for 25 years and knew the way I knew my own hands. I opened the junction box. I replaced the fuse from the spares I kept in the utility cabinet. I reconnected the wire, stripping the insulation with my pocket knife, twisting the copper leads together, taping the connection. My hands were wet and cold, and they did what they had always done, which was the work that needed to be done. I closed the box. I flipped the switch. The light came on. It filled the lantern room the way sunrise fills a room, all at once, and from every direction. The amber warmth pouring through the Fresnel lens and spreading out into the storm in every direction, cutting through the rain and the wind and the darkness like a declaration that some things do not stop simply because the world asks them to. I stood in the light, and I felt the tower sway beneath me, and I listened to the storm rage against the glass, and I looked out at the Atlantic, which was enormous and angry and completely indifferent to what I had just done. And I did not care about its indifference because I had not done it for the Atlantic. I had done it for Eleanor. I had done it for the promise I made her. I climbed back down 97 steps, slowly, my knee aching, my hands raw. The flashlight dead now, but the stairwell no longer dark because the light above was burning again, sending its amber pulse down through the spiral the way it had for 25 years. The lighthouse breathing. I reached the bottom. I took off my boots. I went to the kitchen and made a cup of coffee and stood at the window and waited. The storm broke just before dawn. The clouds pulled apart like curtains, and the sky behind them was the cleanest blue I had seen in months, washed and deep and new, the kind of sky that only comes after something violent has passed through. I took my coffee up to the top of the tower. I sat on the step where Eleanor used to sit, and I looked out at the ocean, calm now, flat, silver in the early light. I said, still standing. Ellie, still standing. There are mornings that feel like beginnings, even when nothing has officially begun. This was one of them. A Saturday in September, a year and a month after the town hall meeting, and the light through the kitchen window had that quality it gets in early fall, softer than summer, more golden, the kind of light that makes ordinary things look like they have been placed there carefully by someone who understood composition. I made 2 cups of coffee, one for me, one for Eleanor. I set hers on the windowsill the way I always did, facing the ocean, the steam rising in the cool air and catching the light. I stood there for a moment with my cup in my hands, and I said what I always said. Morning. Ellie. Then I said, Lucas is coming this weekend. He is bringing a girl. First one he has ever mentioned. Her name is Claire. He says she reads poetry. I think you would like her. I think you would sit with her in the reading room and pull books off the shelves and test her on Hopkins and Bishop and Dickinson. And I think she would pass. And I think you would look at me later with that look you had when something pleased you. The one where your eyes got a little wider and you pressed your lips together as if you were trying not to smile, but had already lost the argument. I drank my coffee. I washed the cup. I left Eleanor's where it was. I climbed the 97 steps. My knees had their opinions. My back had its commentary. I climbed anyway because that is what I do, and it is what I will do for as long as my legs agree to carry me up. And when they no longer agree, I will find another way, because the promise I made was not conditional on the cooperation of my joints. The light was burning. I checked the connections I had repaired after the storm, the new fuse, the retaped wire, the glazing panel Frank had helped me replace the week after. Everything held. Everything was solid. I stood at the top and looked out at the Atlantic. The water was calm, blue-gray. The surface broken only by the wake of a fishing boat heading south toward Wildwood. The roses below were still blooming, the last of the season, deep red against the green of the garden. And the observation platform Lucas and I had built jutted out over the east wall like a hand reaching toward the water. I thought about what a year can hold. How much can fit inside 12 months if you let it? How a man can go from sitting alone in a kitchen talking to a photograph to standing at the top of a tower he rebuilt, surrounded by the evidence that his life had mattered, that the things he built had lasted, that the people he loved had not disappeared but had changed form. The way light changes form when it passes through glass. Still there, still bright, just moving in a different direction. I thought about Eleanor, not with sadness this time, with gratitude for the 25 years she gave me in this lighthouse, for the poems she wrote and the roses she planted and the letter she hid behind a loose brick, because she knew me well enough to know I would need it, and she loved me well enough to make sure it was there. I thought about Lucas, about the boy who climbed out a window and ran through the dark to protect an old man he loved. About the essay he wrote that said faithfulness was not a word his generation used often, but it was the only word that fit. About the way he climbed the stairs beside me on summer mornings, matching his pace to mine without being asked. The way you walk beside someone when you want them to know you are not in a hurry and you are not going anywhere. I thought about Frank, who had driven 4 hours in the middle of the night because I called. About Earl and Hank and Douglas, who had stood up in a room full of strangers and said, "This is what kind of man he is." About Diane, who had taken my case because her father had been a man who built things with his hands, and she understood what it meant to protect what someone had built. I thought about Mitchell. I had spoken to him twice since December. Short conversations. Careful ones. He was working as a clerk in a hardware store in Trenton, the kind of job a man takes when he has been stripped down to the frame and is trying to figure out what to build on top of it. He had not asked for money. He had not asked for forgiveness. He had asked how I was doing, and he had listened to my answer, and he had said he was going to keep trying. I did not know if he would, but the door was where I had left it, and it was his to open or not open, and that was enough for now. I looked down from the tower at Eleanor's walk, the gravel path that led from the road to the front gate. The roses lined one side. The observation platform was visible on the other. The workshop door was open. The exhibition room window caught the morning light. This is what remains. I thought, not the things that were taken, not the signatures that were forged or the cameras that were hidden or the lies that were told. What remains is what was built, what was planted, what was kept burning through the nights and the storms and the years when it would have been easier to let it go dark. I heard a bus on the road, the 2:15 from Philadelphia, the same bus Lucas had taken every time he came to visit, the one that stopped at the last shelter before the Cape May Marina. I watched it slow down. I watched the doors open. Lucas stepped off, backpack on one shoulder. Beside him, a young woman with dark hair pulled back and a book in her hand. And even from the top of the tower, I could see that she was looking at the lighthouse the way Eleanor had looked at it the first time, with the expression of someone who has just found something they did not know they were looking for. They walked up Eleanor's walk together. Lucas pointed at the roses. He pointed at the tower. He looked up and saw me standing at the top, the way he always looked up when he arrived, checking to see if the old man was there. I raised my hand. He raised his. A lighthouse does not move. The storms come and the waves crash and the ships change course and the seasons turn and the people you love leave and the people you did not expect arrive. But the light stays on. That is its only job. That is its entire purpose. To stand in one place and burn and burn and burn. Not because anyone is watching, not because anyone is counting. but because someone, once, a long time ago, asked you to keep it lit. And you said yes. And you meant it. The light was on. The coffee was made. The roses were blooming. The boy was home. Eleanor's lighthouse was still standing. Sometimes life teaches us its most important lessons through the people who hurt us the most. Henry Calloway did not ask to become a symbol of anything. He was just a man who made 2 cups of coffee every morning and climbed a flight of stairs because he had promised the woman he loved that he would keep a light burning. But in doing those small things, day after day, year after year, without applause and without an audience, he became something larger than himself. He became proof that dignity is not something anyone can take from you. It is something you keep or you give away. And the choice is always yours. There is a verse that says, "The Lord is a refuge for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble." Henry found that stronghold, not in anger, not in revenge, but in the quiet faithfulness of a life lived with purpose. God does not always remove the storm. Sometimes He gives us the strength to climb 97 steps in the dark and fix what is broken with our own hands. And sometimes, when we least expect it, God places a letter behind a loose brick in a wall, written by someone who loved us enough to prepare for a day they would not live to see. If this story touched something inside you, if it made you think about the promises you have made and the lights you are keeping, I would love to hear about it. Leave a comment below and tell me what you are holding on to. What is the light you refuse to let go out? Share this story with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you have not already, subscribe to this channel so you do not miss the next story. Because every story we tell here is a reminder that the strongest people in the world are not the loudest. They are the ones still standing when the storm is over.